All right, back in Simio, here to talk about the definitions tabs. The definitions tab contains all sorts of different data types within inside Simio. So let's just go piece by piece, and I'll talk about some of these items. Some of them are less used in the simpler models than others. The elements tab is a very important type of data. So this is a model component with specific built-in properties, states, and behavior, meaning you create one of these things and it has some inherent properties that are useful within Simio, so you don't have to create things from scratch. Some of these generic elements are things like a timer. A timer is thing like you could set it up to trigger every 24 hours or every week. Some of the other ones that are useful might be things like materials. Materials can be consumed or tracked, and materials can belong to inventories, or you could track the cost of something. These all have some detailed logic that I would advise you to go look up in the Simio reference guide if you have more questions. Some of the most used elements are statistics. So the statistics that you can use, uh, the three most common one are tally statistics. So tally statistic is used to take an observation of a value. So let's imagine that we're just trying to take an observations triggered by certain events. We could append or add different observations to an array of observations and then get some statistics on it, like the max and the min and the average. So this is really good for if you want to take intermittent, um, not continuous observations of a value. A state statistic is something that will record and report statistics on the value of a specified state variable. So we'll talk about state variables here in a bit, but imagine you want a time-weighted average of the number of people in line of a certain type. This would be great to track that, and you're going to be able to get some statistics about the average, the max, the min, the final with a state statistic. The output statistic is useful for just reporting one number. All you want to do is report at the end of your simulation. I just want to report the one number, the number of observed bulks, for example. Um, each of these has their own different inherent properties in terms of how it functions. So I'd advise you to once again go look in the Simio reference guide if you want more details. Okay, so now that we've covered the elements, let's talk about properties. So property is a static input parameter for an object that doesn't change during the running of a simulation. So um, let's click on properties. Imagine you had like a capacity of a server. You wanted to say, hey, I want to make my capacity of my server 6. Well, we could create under the standard property an integer data type and say that this integer, close this integer, I'm going to call it the server capacity. And then I would, set the default value to maybe the server. There's 4 servers, right? And I could reference, oh, see, now we're discovering something here. The display name, the display name server capacity is not the same as the inherent underlying name. So you see how appearance says display name? I'm going to actually go change the general name to server capacity. And I'll call this server capacity property, just to keep everything straight. So the default value would be 4, and then I could reference server capacity property. Oh, I misspelled that in my model, and then it would reference the value 4 because that's not going to change during the run of my simulation, for example. Um, Other data types include things like strings, enums, booleans, real. That would be like a floating point number, for example. And there are lots of different properties, right? If I could scroll down here, tons of different properties that I can reference and keep static throughout the simulation. There are also some element references, right? So I could reference a material element that was created previously with a property and assign it a value that would be static throughout the run of the simulation. There are also object references. So for example, um, let's do like a node, right? A node instance property. It's giving me some value here. The default value, I want the node instance property to be default input at customer sync, for example, right? These are things that are useful to point to an item within the simulation so that you can link things together in a way that is repeatable versus if I were in the facility view, I would have to hard code a lot of these values in, and then changing them would be tedious to go through and adjusting them versus having some property and then adjusting the value here in the properties view. Okay, so I'm going to remove these. Let's go to states. A state is a variable. So this is something that we expect to change. Usually states are things like parameters that might change over time, like the number of bulks observed. Like you want to keep track of that number. That could be an output statistic. Or you might say that, hey, I want the capacity to increase over time. So you could create a variable that would trigger an increase, an increment based on certain logic. There are similar, if I click on states, there are similar data types. You have reals, integers, booleans, date, time, lists, strings, the same element references that we saw before, and the same object references. These will basically just track levels, or at least like values at different times. There's some more advanced ones like levels, as well as levels with acceleration. These are more useful for factories and flow models, for example. Um, the last thing that I'll talk about is lists. So lists are ordered uh, collections of things that you could point an object to look through. So for example, if I wanted a node list, I could ensure that um, in order, I could have an entity look at the input at two different service blocks and choose which one had the smallest line, for example. Um, so this tab is very powerful. You're essentially going to do things like create properties, which you're going to reference in your model as static input parameters. You will create states. These are variables that will track things like your output parameters. And then in your elements block, you might have some other types, but you will also create these statistics that will take your state variables. So for example, a state statistic, and look at a state variable and then make sure that this statistic shows up in your results. So let's say I create, some real state variable, call it number balked, for example. Okay, if I run my simulation and I keep track of the number that balked, it will not by default show up in my results tab. And that's useful because you don't want every background decision variable or property to show up in your results tab because it would get very messy. There might be some things that you use for logic inside your simulation, but you don't really care to report them in your results. But let's say you care about the number balked. In my elements tab, this state statistic can reference, let's reference number balked. Yeah, so now it's going to look at this and it's going to track it as a time-weighted statistic to keep track of it. So I'll just call this num balked stat. Okay, and then this would show up in my results tab. So I hope that you guys found that useful. Good luck with this and happy modeling.